You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Part 7. Clover Wells had not been lying when she said she needed a stronger drink before talking about Barnaby Ratcliffe. Unlike her genteel, slow sipping of the tea, when it came to the sherry, Mrs. Wells went through several glasses in the space of about a minute. I kept mine to the side untouched, as she did so. For all I knew, I'd need it when she'd finished whatever story she'd told me. After the third glass had disappeared down her throat, Mrs. Wells spoke again. "Right," she said, wiping her mouth with a napkin as she hiccuped slightly. "You're absolutely sure you need to know about Barnaby Ratcliffe?" I nodded again, trying to keep the gesture minimally impatient, even though I was bursting to hear. Mrs. Wells seemed to be beyond disappointment at my insistence, so instead of sighing, she simply got a saturnine look on her face and began. "All right," she said, clearing her throat. "First of all, let me say I am a Christian woman, Miss Sutton. I don't hold with saying things against children, particularly orphans, if I can help it. The good Lord smiles on us all, and on the least of us he smiles the most. What I am about to tell you, therefore, I will tell with every ounce of charity I can muster, even given the subject." She seemed to say this almost to give herself permission. I gave her a soft smile and said I understood. She nodded crisply. "Good," she said, "because whatever his misfortune as an orphan, Miss Sutton, Barnaby Ratcliffe was a bad little boy. In fact, well, it doesn't seem right to just call him bad. He was the kind of bad child that you could tell is bad the same way a sick person is contagious. In fact, I'm quite sure he wasn't right in the head, and the children could sense it too. Barney, they used to call him, though never in his hearing, because the good Lord knows that that boy had a way of inspiring fear. In fact, and I'd swear to this before the good Lord himself, I'd wager that almost everything that went wrong at the charity school from about 1910 to 1915 had something to do with him. He came to us quite young, you see, but by the time he'd hit 7, you'd think Barnaby had the devil in him." This wasn't quite what I was looking for, so I cut in. "So the terrible about him is that he was a bully?" "Oh, no," laughed Mrs. Wells with the bitter relish as she poured herself another glass of sherry. "That was only the most normal part of his being a nuisance. As I said, I think he must have been sick in the head. Nothing else would explain what happened when he slept." My blood felt like it had turned to ice. "What do you mean?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. "That's what I'm about to tell you, dear," Mrs. Wells said with not a little shortness. "Now do let me go on. Where was I? Ah, yes, Barnaby's sleep disturbances. Well, to start with, unlike most of the other children, we decided early on to give Barnaby his own room and lock him in, just because we didn't want to know what he'd do to the children while they slept, if he was such a menace while they were awake. We thought it would give us peace of mind." Another gulp of sherry. What a laugh that turned out to be. Barnaby couldn't help being trouble even when he was asleep. His first night alone we heard screaming that would wake the dead coming from his room. We rushed to it and opened the door to find Barnaby writhing around on his bed and screaming all the while he was still asleep. We tried to grab him and wake him up, but the little bugger got violent as soon as we touched him. Started kicking and punching and biting like he was fighting for his life. Oh, of course, he did wake up eventually, and we thought it must have just been a particularly bad dream. But it kept happening. Can you imagine waking up to mad screams and braving an increasingly big, strong, savage little boy fighting you in his sleep every night, Miss Sutton? It takes a mite out of a girl. I sometimes wonder if my joints aren't in the state they're in because one or two of the blows I got from Barnaby Ratcliffe. Why, one time I swear he must have sprained my arm the way he tore at it, and that wasn't all. She complained a bit more, but my mind was racing too fast to notice most of it. It didn't make any sense. The fact that Barnaby Ratcliffe had recurring nightmares wasn't all that surprising in retrospect. But what it implied about my own dreams was still deeply unsettling. Not wanting to leap to conclusions, I cut in with a question. Did he ever say anything? I asked. When he was screaming, were there any words? Words? Mrs. Wells' brow furrowed. What a queer question. But, since you mention it, yes, I think there were. As I recall, he kept saying either, "Get them off me," or "Get it off me," or variations on that. I ought to have remembered it after this long, but I suppose that the fact that it was always so similar must have stuck. I picked up my glass of sherry and drank it hastily before Mrs. Wells could see my hands shaking. I didn't need to ask what it or them were. I knew. I'd met it in my dreams. But what did this mean? How had I somehow managed to share nightmares with a boy who was having them from 1910 to 1915, despite being born decades later? It didn't make sense, unless I found my next question. So what happened to Barnaby Ratcliffe, I asked, when he grew up? Nothing, dear, said Mrs. Wells, because he didn't grow up. He's dead? I asked, feeling my hand shake even harder under the table. But to my surprise, Mrs. Wells shook her head. No, dear, he's not dead, she said. Some might say he may as well be, but life is life. Then why? Barnaby Ratcliffe has been in a coma since 1915, said Mrs. Wells. He fell down several flights of the charity school stairs, and he suffered permanent brain damage. The doctor said it might be kinder to let him die, but the charitable societies who sustained the school wouldn't hear of it, so they paid to keep him in care, and as far as I know, they kept at it until the NHS took over. I asked after him with some hospitals when I got your letter and thought of the charity school. Evidently he's still alive and still comatose. This was slightly comforting, since knowing I'd been sharing dreams with a coma patient was better than thinking my old room might have been haunted by his ghost. But it still didn't answer how that was happening or why. However, this old woman almost certainly wouldn't know the answer to either of those questions, and would probably think I was mad for asking. I decided to ask the only thing left to ask, therefore. Do you happen to know which hospital he's in, Mrs. Wells? No, the old woman replied. I couldn't very well go asking that without saying I was family, and they knew he had none. The National Health Service were willing to tell me they had him listed as a one-time patient, and that was about all. Well, not all. They did say he wasn't a patient of theirs anymore. You mean he was discharged after this long? I asked, raising my eyebrows in surprise. Well, that puzzled me too, said Mrs. Wells. So I asked, and, well, for some reason, some anonymous philanthropist took an interest in him and had him moved to a private hospital in America, of all places. Can you imagine? I could imagine. In fact, not only could I imagine that, I could also imagine just who that philanthropist most likely was. I immediately changed tact and asked the question I hoped would get me my next lead. Mrs. Wells, I said, let me get back to when this Barnaby boy was a child. Do you happen to remember if he was at all close with Nettie Reynolds? A look of rueful, dark humor crossed the old woman's face. Not in the sense you mean, she said. But, oh, yes, they were close. Nettie was probably Barnaby's favorite victim for his cruelty before the accident. quite between us. She leaned in and whispered, "Most of the staff suspected that Nettie might have been the one who pushed him down those stairs to begin with." Eureka! That was all I needed. After making conversation for a few more minutes, I thanked her for her time and excused myself, rushing to the nearest payphone and feeding it with many, many coins in preparation for a long-distance call. I pulled the private number for Barnett Reynolds out of my purse and dialed it. The same secretary picked up, and when I said I wanted to request a meeting with Barnett Reynolds, inquired just as curtly after what my reason was for the meeting. This time I had a good answer. "My name is Emma Sutton," I said. "I need to talk to him about Barnaby Ratcliffe." There was a conspicuous, surprised pause at the other end of the line. Then, after a few moments, during which I suspected I'd been put on hold, the voice sounded again. "Mr. Reynolds can see you in 3 weeks here at his estate, Miss Sutton," the secretary informed me. "I can supply you with the address. Do you have a pen handy?" I did.